We need to get started. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the latest in Plantlife's autumn series of talks, Fall into Nature. This is a program, part of a program of events which is happening all the way through October, which is essentially showcasing and highlighting the importance of plants and the importance of wild plant populations and why they're more vital now than ever before. Plantlife is the nature conservation charity that takes action for wild plants. And what we're going to be doing this lunchtime is finding out about one of the ways that we do that. So my name's Alistair. I'm Alistair White. I'm the head of Plantlife Scotland. I'm joined today by Michael Scott and Roxanne Anderson, both of whom I will introduce properly in a minute. Behind the scenes, we've also got Erin Schott, who's Plantlife Scotland comms and policy officer, who's making sure that everything runs smoothly, but also knows a huge amount about the kind of policy framework that this whole topic sits in. So it's great to have Erin as part of the event as well. So just to let you know what's going to happen, we will be talking for around about 40 to 45 minutes. After that, there's going to be the chance to ask the panel questions. We'll have probably around about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. So you can ask questions, and I'll remind you when we get to that point, you can ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box, which you should see on your screen. And just to let you know, we are recording this webinar and it will be available later on YouTube. So definitely a good chance to ask questions. We've got two people here today who know a huge amount about this topic. Take advantage of that, ask questions, no such thing as a silly question. Fire your comments into the Q&A box, and yeah, let's just create a bit of a buzz around this event. If you're on social media, feel free to tweet about it, and yeah, let's just have some good chat and discussion. Okay, so just a couple of minutes from me. This is a lunchtime talk on a sunny Friday afternoon, and I really don't want to put you off your sandwiches or your cup of soup or whatever you might be enjoying at the moment. But we're living through not one, but two crises which are inextricably interlinked with each other. And that's the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. And the nature reserve that we're going to be visiting today is right at the heart of that intersection between the climate emergency and the catastrophic loss of biodiversity which we're seeing across the planet. And I think everybody knows that world leaders are meeting in a couple of weeks in Glasgow at COP26 to try to agree targets to bring the climate crisis under control. And also, you might have seen world leaders are meeting or have been meeting this week at COP15 to try to agree targets to halt biodiversity loss. COP15 is the biodiversity equivalent of COP26. Now, the depressing fact is that world leaders did meet 10 years ago to try to agree targets to halt biodiversity loss in 2010. They're known as the Aichi targets. And 10 years later, the international community had failed to fully meet even one of those targets. And biodiversity is still in free fall. It's in massive decline. Recent research by the Natural History Museum and by the RSPB have shown us that the UK is at the bottom of the G7 league table for how much biodiversity is left. Scotland is doing a bit better than the other countries in the UK, but it's still a terrible place to be. So charities like Plantlife respond to these threats in different ways. We campaign, we try to get governments to take action at scale to stop declines. We work with landowners, we work with communities to try to empower people to take action on their own. And we create nature reserves, and we actually manage land ourselves as refuges for wildlife. Now, why do we do this? Owning nature reserves is never going to be enough. It's a drop in the ocean. It's never going to be enough on its own to halt the loss of biodiversity. But nature reserves are lifeboats, really, for the last remaining scraps of biodiversity. If we can manage them well, then the wildlife that thrives there can go on to populate the wider countryside. Nature reserves can demonstrate to other landowners what can be achieved, inspiring other people to take action. Nature reserves are places where we can really get people excited about the natural world. We can let people immerse themselves in nature and really get close to nature. And crucially, nature places are hugely important for research, helping to build our understanding of how complex ecosystems work. So, all those kind of thoughts, all those kind of things were bouncing around my head as I headed up north for the first time, right up to the far north of Scotland, not long after I started working for Plantlife, to see our Munsary Nature Reserve for the very first time and to meet the Munsary Nature Reserve Advisory Committee. Now, the first person that I was due to meet on that trip was Michael Scott, the chair of the committee. And I've got to admit, not going to lie, I was a little bit nervous. Oh. I wasn't long in the job, and Michael is undoubtedly, he's one of the big names in nature conservation in Scotland. Michael is a founder member of Plantlife, and he was Plantlife's Scottish officer from 1990 through until 2004. Essentially, he did my job for 14 years. He was instrumental in setting up Munsary Nature Reserve, as we're about to hear. He has been chair of Scottish Environment Link. He was deputy chair of Scottish Natural Heritage, as was, of course, it's Nature Scot now. Michael was awarded an OBE. He was awarded an OBE in 2005 for services to biodiversity conservation in Scotland. And now he's an extremely in-demand and, I would say, very well-travelled writer, broadcaster, and speaker. No wonder I was nervous. Actually, it turns out I had nothing to be nervous about at all, because he's also one of the nicest people you can meet. He's hugely generous with his knowledge. He's great company. He's really good fun, and it's fantastic to have him here today. One of the next people that I met on that trip up to Munsary was Roxanne Anderson. So Roxanne is a senior research fellow at the North Highland College's Environmental Research Institute, part of the University of the Highlands and Islands in Thurso. And earlier this year, Roxanne was awarded the title of Professor in recognition of her outstanding research activity, her leadership skills, and her contribution to education. Since 2012, Roxanne has led a collaborative and comprehensive program of research on peatlands and ecological restoration, and has really spearheaded a new understanding of the importance of peatlands and ecological restoration, biodiversity, carbon capture, and climate. I'm amazed, actually, that she has time to sit on our reserve advisory committee, but she does, and I'm so grateful that she does. And she's also found the time to be here today to tell us about her work at Munsary, her research, and what it is teaching us about the importance of peatlands. So we're in good hands. That's enough from me. It's time to wander across the vast expanse of Munsary under those huge, never-ending skies. And who better to start us off on that journey than Michael Scott? Michael, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alistair. I think that introduction just basically said I'm an old git that's been around for a long time. I'm very grateful to all these words from Alistair. And a very good afternoon to you from the West Highlands of Scotland. That view behind me is the view from the house where I'm lucky enough to live. It's not quite as clear as that today, but it's still looking pretty nice on this particular day when we're trying to talk to you. And I have got to do one thing, which is to make that happen, and then in a minute that happened. Right. I'm actually not going to quite start off with Munsary, if you'll forgive me. I want to put in a bit of historic background before I get there, and to take you back actually 34 years to 1987. I did say I was an old git, didn't I? Which was actually 3 years before Plantlife was even formed. Back then, I knew there was this big area of bogland up in the far north of Caithness and Sutherland. I'd seen it from the road up to Thurso. I knew it was a wild landscape of big skies, as Alistair was describing there, but I'd never actually stopped to look at the flow country. But then someone had the bright idea of doing this, planting trees on the bogs, non-native conifers, inevitably. Now, to be fair, one of the motivations for the scheme was to bring jobs to a part of the world where jobs were traditionally very hard to come by. But how many jobs and at what cost? Maybe if you look at that photograph clearly, you can see that in the middle there's a little group of pools. And it's that feature of patterned pools, or dúlachans, that makes the peatlands of Caithness so special. And the trouble is that trees and dúlachans simply do not belong together. In 1987, the plans to plant trees in these peatlands hit the headlines, and I played my part in the process. Back in those days, I did a lot of work for the BBC, including writing for BBC Wildlife magazine, which in those days was still a credible campaigning environmental publication. I was given a 2-page spread to cover the story of what was going on there. And if we read the introduction, it says, why would anyone want to plant trees in a place that is so unpromising to forestry and so valuable in so many other respects? Well, for a start, there are certain tax advantages. As an environmental writer, I couldn't believe when I ended up writing. It was more like I'd turned into an investigative financial journalist. I spent hours being briefed by informed sources, as they say, on how that scheme had actually turned out to be a brilliant tax break for the wealthy. You can probably see lots of figures on the screen there, all relating, as it says, to a notional 254 hectare moor. Except that the example wasn't notional. It all related to an estate that had been bought the previous year by the broadcaster Terry Wogan. And Wogan wasn't the only one. Financial advisors were encouraging lots of other wealthy folk to do exactly the same thing. To be fair again, I don't think anyone in government ever imagined that the scheme would end up being used in such a perverse way. And it did certainly bring money into Caithness and Sutherland. But the trouble was that most of the jobs went to the forestry consultancies from well outside the area. Conservationists were up in arms. Later in 1987, the Nature Conservancy Council, as it still was then, still covering the whole of the UK, published this report, Birds, Bogs and Forestry. It argued that the peatlands of Caithness and Sutherland were possibly the largest single expanse of blanket bog in the world, and certainly the largest area of international significance anywhere in the UK, or I should say international conservation significance, at least anywhere in the UK. But the peatlands were being fragmented and decimated by these forestry plantations. And to support its case, the report highlighted the importance of the area for birds, although it did mention plants as well, to be fair. The next year, it published another report. And one of the authors of the report, Derrick Radcliffe, the brilliant chief scientist of the NCC, he had had a brainwave. He decided that one of the ways to protect the area was to give it a name. And he came up with this name, the flow country. And that really solidified the case for protecting the whole area of peatlands. It should really be the flow country, because flow, from an Old Norse word, is the term occasionally used in that part of the world for a huge expanse of flat, deep, wet bog. That report was based on 7 years of fieldwork by a peatland research team. And the members of that team included someone called Richard Lindsay, who I'll come back to in a moment. And it also included this lady that some of you might recognise. She's Jane Smart, Dr. Jane Smart, who is one of the original masterminds behind Plantlife and went on to be its first director, and a huge inspiration to all of us who worked with Plantlife back then. In the early 1980s, Jane had studied the Dúlóchans at Munsary as part of her PhD thesis, which was an amazing coincidence. It meant we actually had an in-house expert later when we came to buy the reserve. Now, there's a lot of politics from that period, and you'll be relieved to hear I don't have time to go into all of that today. But the important outcome in the budget of March 1988 was that the commercial woodlands were removed from the scope of income tax and corporation tax, and that ended those perverse tax incentives. In 1989, I went to visit the area again to present a Living World radio programme about the area for the BBC, for Radio 4. And my guides were now Professor Des Thompson in green in the photograph there, and a great friend of Plantlife in blue, that Richard Lindsay, who I mentioned a moment ago. And I got to see for myself these famous patterned pools, the Dúlóchans of the peatlands. And they showed me just how forestry was changing the area. By then, I'd actually become the Scottish representative of CABS, which was in effect the predecessor body to Plantlife. Then in November 1989, I was lucky enough to attend the launch of Plantlife. And that is where this venerable sweatshirt came from, which is why I'm wearing it today. They were only available in extra large because they had to fit David Bellamy. And fortunately, I'm rather the same shape as David, so I was able to wear one of those sweatshirts as well. Soon after that, when Plantlife was officially formed, technically, I think I was the very first employee of Plantlife, because I was employed by CABS and Plantlife took over the responsibilities of CABS. I was certainly one of the first employees of Plantlife as its Scottish officer. And if you look back in the archives, in 1990, the first issue of Plantlife's newsletter, which was the predecessor to the wonderful colourful magazine that we have these days, it included a report on Plantlife's response to a new threat to Britain's last great wilderness, which was the Flow Country. So all of that is background to our purchase of Munsary. But the reason I wanted to consider it is because I do think we have made progress since then. I think a scheme like that would be totally unthinkable today. The value of peatlands are recognised, and the priorities of the climate crisis that Alistair was talking about made it all the more important to recognise those peatlands. But it does also show the impact that public policy can have if governments are truly committed to that policy. In the course of seven years, 63 square miles of trees had been planted in the Flow Country. It might not have been what we wanted, but in public policy terms, the public policy did succeed remarkably in its objective. And I think there's a lesson in that today for peatland conservation and restoration. Right, let's jump forward a couple of years to 1997. I happened to be flying back to Edinburgh from a holiday in Orkney when I spotted this view out of the window of the aeroplane. I worked out that I was looking at forestry in the Flow Country. That there is the Rowans plantation of what was then Forest Enterprise, now Forest and Land Scotland. And this that I've highlighted there, that looks like a bit like a swarm of flies or something, is actually one of those sets of patterned pools that belongs with the forest, the Rowans Dúlóchans. But there's a much larger area of pools up there, and those are the Munsary Dúlóchans, and they're now part of our Plantlife reserve. At about the time I took that photograph in 1997, Scottish Natural Heritage, as it had become by then, was in the process of buying the land from the Sinclair estate, which was proposing to plant Christmas trees as a commercial crop over the bogland at Munsary. They wanted to protect the land. The UK government of the day was not terribly sympathetic to conservation mechanisms. So they said, SNH, if you want to protect that land, you've got to buy it. But they didn't like SNH owning any of the land. So they said that SNH had to buy the land and then sell it on to a benign conservation owner. So in 1999, I found myself helping put together a friendly negotiation for Plantlife to buy the land at Munsary from SNH. Although I actually had to keep out of the actual negotiations because by then I'd just been appointed as the deputy chair of SNH. So I was helping the process along, making sure it all ran smoothly, but not getting involved too much on one side or the other. And in that photograph, as best as I can work out, those are the boundaries of the reserve that we have today in that shot. It is a big reserve. It covers over 1,200 hectares or more than 3,000 acres. One of the conditions that SNH put on us was that we had to have a local advisory group to help us manage the reserve. I would have suggested that to Jane anyway, but SNH gave me the ammunition to make that happy. And there's our management group at the opening of the reserve, official opening in July 2000. Sadly, only 2 of us in that photograph are still active in the management group today, and 3 very good friends of Munsary in that photograph have since passed away. The gentleman on the left is Jamie Stone, who back then was an MSP, but now is the MP for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, and he's always been a very keen supporter of the reserve and a good friend to us. Munsary is important because most of it is a wetland, the easternmost component of that internationally important flow country habitat. And an especially important feature of it are those dewlochans that I was talking about, the patterned pools, which rather perversely to my mind, all seem to develop on the highest point of the Peatland hummock. And I'm told you have to go to the north of Finland or to Russia to see equivalent areas of patterned pools to these ones in Caithness. As you can see there, it is a place of open landscapes and big skies. It's not a wonderful flowery place full of rare species. Its key importance is as a habitat, as part of that flow country habitat. It's so flat that it's not an easy place to capture in a photograph. And it's also not an easy place to get around. I remember being there once and taking a group round, including a very enthusiastic young Spanish student. And I thought he'd discovered an interesting plant because he was down on his hands and knees looking at this plant. And I turned around to say, well, what is it you found? And I discovered he'd actually sunk into his knees in the bog. It's that sort of a place. It's also 4 miles from the nearest road. Access is through our neighbour's land along a track that's a rough track of a working farm. And actually, technically, we only have a right of access for management purposes. Now, visitors are welcome along that track, but it is a 4-mile walk, and you can never quite tell who you might meet along the way. And the cattle inevitably leave their mark along the track, or rather lots and lots of accumulating marks along the track, especially at a couple of places where they congregate to feed. We did create a set of signboards along the track into the reserve, and that's our late friend Ken Butler with one of these boards. But to be honest, at the moment, we're seriously considering whether to discontinue that trail because the access issues are so problematical along that track at the moment. But very early on, we recognised that that Munsary did not have the capacity to be a wonderful tourist attraction, bringing in large numbers of people. So we decided that one of our priorities instead should be to make it a centre for scientific research. Richard Lindsay worked with us to find funding for a really top-end survey of the reserve, and he returned 3 times to do a survey with his students from the University of East London of the reserve and its components. And there he is, for example, using the latest high-tech method to record the depth of one of the dewlochans. Notice his feet. He's wearing snowshoes. They make it much easier to walk over the bog without sinking up to your knees in that squidgy peat. And more importantly, they minimise damage to the bog surface. So we ask all visitors to the Doolochans these days to wear those snow shoes. In that survey of 2002, one of Richard's colleagues discovered this on the reserve there, which is yellow marsh saxifrage, a declining species of base-rich flushes, known only from a very few sites in Britain and listed as a European priority species. There had been one old, rather dubious record for the species in Caithness, but that was from before 1970. And the small patch in Munsary emerges from a spring from some gravelly ground. But in that small patch, more than 1,000 flower heads of the saxifrage were counted in 2003. And that made it the largest site for the species in Scotland and possibly the largest in the UK. So it very much became a priority for us in looking after the reserve. That survey also found a small group of another nationally scarce species, appropriately enough called bog orchid, and that was the first record for that in Caithness, although I should admit that my photograph there isn't actually from Munsary. But the most special plants of the reserve are the bog mosses, not just in their own right, because it's the mosses that form the peat that forms the bog. And they're the ones that actively lock up the carbon that accumulates in the peat. And some of them are rather lovely, like these clusters of the rusty bog moss, which look to me almost like the florets of a cauliflower. That's one of 11 species of sphagnum that we've recorded so far in the reserve. The past owners of the estate had tried to turn the bog into better land for sheep grazing, with spectacularly little success, I have to say. But to us, that was like draining the sap out of a precious tree. So one of our first priorities was to set about blocking up these grips, as the drains are called. We had an exciting day in 2003, guiding a helicopter to drop piles of materials as near as possible to the drains that we wanted to block. And then these metal dams were slotted together and pushed in to the drains to block the drainage out of these drains. And within a few years, the drains were working, the ditches were stopping running, and the sphagnum was taking over. And there's Joe Costley, Plantlife's former reserves manager, admiring the success of our work in blocking some of those grips. Joe has just left Plantlife after, I believe, 25 years with the organisation, and I'd like today to record my thanks for all that he's done and to wish him all the very best for whatever it is he decides to do next. I'll certainly miss him. In recent years, we've been hugely helped by the work we're doing at Munsary, as Alistair has already said, by the help from the Environmental Research Institute in Thurso, which is part of the University of the Highlands and Islands. And that work has become even more important as we look forward to the COP Climate Change Summit in Glasgow in a couple of weeks' time. And so to tell you more about that work, I'm going to hand over now to our distinguished professor, to Roxanne Anderson.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm just going to share my screen as well to get started. So thank you very much, and thank you, Alistair, for the opportunity to talk today about some of the work that we've been doing at Munsary. Thank you, Michael, for the very kind introduction as well, and providing all the background that I won't need to repeat today for this very short presentation. As you've heard, I joined the ERI and kind of moved up north to the north of the Scotland to Thurso in 2012, and that's really when I started to engage with Plantlife and Munsary in particular, and this is where we decided to try to coordinate a little bit more the activities and the research that was going on around the north of Scotland to make the most out of the excellent sites that we had. And what I want to do today, I can't cover everything that we've been doing since, because there's been a huge amount of research and a huge amount of people involved in the research. But I just wanted to cover some of the most recent and maybe exciting research that's been taking place. and really to highlight the importance of Munsary as a natural laboratory for peatland science, not just for conservation of peatland in the UK, but potentially for peatland conservation around the world. So just to give an idea of the place of Munsary in the global peatland, there are peatlands around the world, and we do have a lot of peatlands in the UK. Peatlands are the most efficient terrestrial carbon store on Earth. They do not cover a very large area of the planet's landmass, only about 3% of the landmass. However, in that landmass, they take up the carbon from the atmosphere, store it into the peat in form of partially decaying organic matter, and do that for thousands and thousands of years. And in doing that, they accumulate vast quantities of carbon underneath the soil or underneath the vegetation. And so a third of the carbon in the soil is actually contained in that 3% of the landmass. So peatlands have a really, really big role to play in terms of climate regulation and carbon sequestration. And obviously, this has become more and more important as we are heading into an uncertain future with the current climate crisis. There are lots of different types of peatlands around the world. And in coastal areas and in islands where the climate is hyperoceanic and influenced by the sea air that comes through and comes over, where the climate is cool year-round, so at high latitude, one particular type of peatland can form, and that is the blanket bog landscape, the blanket bogs. Only 3% of all of the global peatlands are blanket bog. The UK has got a huge proportion of those blanket bog because it sits exactly at the right place in terms of the climate and has the right landscape to enable those habitats. And most of the blanket bogs in the UK are actually in Scotland. And as Michael already articulated very eloquently, the largest blanket bog of them all is the Flow Country in the north of Scotland. So Munsary sits within that Flow Country on the eastern side of the Flow Country, and is an important site because the peatlands in the UK, the blanket bogs in the UK, are important because they are globally quite rare. Now, the peatlands in the UK have had impact from people and have been impacted by forestry, like Michael explained, but also drainage and pollution and other disturbances for a very long period of time. And it is estimated that approximately 80% of all the Scottish peatlands are degraded to some degree. The Flow Country is by and large in much better condition than the rest of the peatlands in the UK, but is still bearing the imprint of some of those degradation. Now, in recent years, and owing to the increased recognition of the peatlands in terms of their importance for biodiversity, climate mitigation, but also provision of water and regulation of water, there's been large-scale investment and programs of restoration that have been started all around Scotland, including in the Flow Country, not least some of the drain blocking that Michael was mentioning earlier on, but also large-scale forestry removal and forest to bog restoration. There is currently 250 million that have been pledged by Scottish Government to increase the efforts over the coming decade, which is the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration. And you'd think that with having all of those peatlands in the UK and with having the largest area of blanket bog in Europe and possibly the best example of that habitat in the world, that we'd know how to map and how to understand these peatlands. However, this is something that is incredibly hard to do. And to this day, we didn't really have any reliable maps of peatland condition. And we cannot currently track the change in peatland condition over time in a reliable way, in a way that is cost effective. And you've heard from Michael that Munsary is one of the very few sites in the UK that has a long-term detailed vegetation record. That was thanks to Richard Lindsay's efforts in setting up that long-term repeat program of monitoring of vegetation carried out every 7 years since 2002. And also because we've decided to focus a lot of effort into research in Munsary. And that enabled us to set up some continuous hydrological recording, so recording of the water table continuously since 2012. Now, having these is really, really important in a range of conditions across the country, but having one site like Munsary where we have long-term data, long-term understanding of the peatland condition, and where we have access to the site for improving our understanding of peatland by developing and deploying research is extremely important. And that has been instrumental in the most recent research that we've been doing, including trying to find a way to map condition of peatland over large scale and over time. So you've noticed in Michael's pictures, and you notice here that there's some strange instrument in the field, including for example here, a bed where Richard is standing on to do his vegetation survey, as well as the snowshoes that he's wearing. And that's because obviously the surface of the peat is quite soft, and there's a potential for sinking in. But that also relates to an absolutely fascinating and interesting properties of peatland. And that is what is known as bog breathing. All peatlands, when they're in good condition, can respond to a change in the volume of water or gas inside of the peat body by rising and falling. As the water increases, as it rains and the bog fills up with water, and as gas is produced underneath, the surface rises. And during the summer months, where typically there's a higher demand on water, the surface will sink down. This phenomenon of bog breathing has been known for a very long time, and we can experience it when we walk on a bog at the very small scale. We can see and feel the surface wobble as we walk over it. It's extremely dynamic, and that dynamism is really important in terms of resilience. However, as you can imagine, this is incredibly difficult to measure on the ground. How do you measure the surface motion if you influence the surface motion yourself? This is why in recent years, we've turned more and more to remote sensing data. And in 2017, we started a collaboration with the University of Nottingham using sentinel data, so radar data. And the radar bounces off the surface of the peatland, and every time the satellite goes around the planet, it builds up a stack of these images of surface distance from the satellite. And with a processing of these images, we can build time series of relative surface motion of the peatland. Now, to understand how these images of surface motion from remote sensing relate to peatland condition, what we need to do is to go to some of the sites where we have a really, really good knowledge and understanding of the condition, like Munsary, and do some validation. The validation can be validating the actual motion of the peat, but also understanding how the different metrics of those surface, the time series of surface motion, relate to what we actually see and feel on the ground. And that is what we've been able to do at Munsary. So over the last few years, we've had a series of programs of research that have enabled us to take that validation to a whole new level and to start mapping the peatlands across really large scale and over time. So that satellite-derived surface motion, what we found with our studies is that it indeed reflects hydrology and ecology of a peatland at a range of scales, going from one small pixel. We can know what is happening in that pixel, but we can also know what is happening at a whole site and potentially at a whole landscape level by looking at how the surface motion or the bog is breathing. And you can see on the slide here 2 examples. So one of the example is actually taken out of Munsary, and that's the curve in blue. And what we can see is over time, a trend of uplift, and that is related to the growth of the peat itself. And we can also see these seasonal oscillation that relate to the movement of the surface as the water goes in and out of the peatland. On the orange, or the orange trend, what we can see is we don't really have these motion regular peaks and troughs, and there is a general trend of subsidence, and that's taken from a degraded site. So effectively, INSAR can become a diagnostic tool for the condition of peatland, and by further validating the different component of these trends of motion, we are then able to do something extraordinary, and it is to map the entire flow country condition over one particular year using those metrics of motion. And I've highlighted here the square where Munsary is, and we can see from that little square that there's a patch of dark blue corresponding to the wet near natural, and that's effectively the Munsary dewlocking that is just highlighted there. This is completely new. This is something that we were not able to do before. Now imagine how powerful this technique is, and that technique has been validated by Munsary again. So this technique is extremely powerful because we can map the whole condition of the flow country at any given point in time, and we can do this repeatedly, year in, year out, or over a number of years to see how that condition changes. We can look at individual sites like Munsary or any other sites in the rest of the country, really, and we can study how they change in response to management intervention, or for example, a climate extreme event. And we can also potentially relate these to carbon emission, and that opens the door to a better understanding of how our action are potentially mitigating or increasing carbon emission from the peatland. And that is really important in the context of climate change. So in the UK, degraded peatland are currently estimated to emit approximately 23 million tons of carbon equivalent per year. And if you don't know if that's enough, if that's a lot or not, that in itself is enough to switch our whole land use and land use change sector from a net sink to a net source of carbon or of greenhouse gases. And of all our peatland, the near natural peatland are estimated to be near neutral, so they're not contributing emissions, greenhouse gas emission, and they're effectively net sinks of CO2. But what we don't know is what happens during droughts, which are expected to become more and more frequent, like climate change. And at Munsary, what is extraordinary is that we have an existing network of research, but we also have the capacity to be extremely responsive. And so when in 2018, there was a large European drought where we saw large anomalies of temperature, warmer than usual across most of the summer and spring, and in particular drier than usual across the summer and spring, we were able to respond with a scientific investigation of what happened during that period of drought. And that's because we have that excellent relationship with Plantlife and that capacity to respond, having already the knowledge of the sites. And what we saw was really interesting. We deployed a large-scale study of greenhouse gas emission, and we used that using the same setup that we had used for the validation of our INSAR study. So we replicated the same plot, we coordinated our efforts, and what we did was a whole series of CO2 emission measurements in situ. We also look at the spectral reflectance, which is the properties of the plant as they respond to light, and that's how that can be used for classification purposes, and in particular with drones. And we did some drone flights, and what we were able to do was then to upscale the fluxes that we were measuring at the very small scale to the whole areas where we had good drone imagery. And that was the basis of a PhD student thesis, Henk Peter Sterk, who've just completed. And it was a really exciting piece of work, but also a very interesting one, because what it revealed was that as a whole, the net ecosystem exchange, if you like, the behavior of Munsary was probably a source. So during the drought in 2019 and the year where the peatland recovered from the drought in 2019, what we saw was that the numbers are positive, which means the carbon is going out into the atmosphere rather than negative, which is when the carbon is going into the peat. So the margins in Munsary were a very small sink, but the pools and the margins in 2019 were all small sources of carbon. So if we extrapolate that at the site of the whole site, it's very likely that it was a net source for that year. So it was not a net sink, and it was not helping us with climate change. And that's because of the pressures that we've been putting on that particularly nice peatland. So imagine if Munsary, a peatland that is in quite good condition, is behaving like a thing. What are those peatlands that are degraded doing? They're probably emitting far more emission than you think they are. And the main reasons for those increases in emission were related to two things: the increase in area of bare peat, where the peat pools had dried up, so they don't have vegetation to take up carbon, and all they do is decompose that peat that is exposed, and also the stress response of the plants. So the plants that are really well adapted to these wet pool conditions, they don't do very well when it gets hot. They tend to shut down, and and the drier air condition mean that they can't photosynthesize as much as they normally do when it's nice, cool and moist. And because of those responses, we've seen this behavior. However, what we were also able to do is to look at the landscape scale response in terms of the surface, the bog breathing again, to try to understand what might happen in the future. And what we saw was that during that drought period, the whole site experienced a very, very rapid collapse of the surface. Effectively, the pores within the sphagnum and all the pores in the peat at the surface collapsed. That surface collapsed and shrunk, effectively tracking the water table. And as that was demonstrated by both measurement on the ground and again our kind of remote sensing measurements. And what we could see with that was a very rapid collapse, and a collapse that wasn't synchronous between the margins and the pools. So the pools collapsed faster, then the margins collapsed a little bit later, and the margins recovered a little bit faster, while the pools took a little bit more time to recover and did not recover fully. So that was some of that collapse will not be recovered, so it won't go back to the same height it was before. And that taught us that, in fact, this is a really, really important internal mechanism of resilience. The fact that the surface collapses means it tracks the water table. The fact that it won't expand back again means that the peat is slightly denser. And in turn, where the peat is denser, it's actually wetter. Counterintuitively, after a drought, the bog is wetter, and that is because it is in such good condition. So whilst it was emitting carbon in the year after the drought, in the year of the drought, the year after the drought, it's highly likely that because it has this fascinating, extraordinary mechanism of resilience, it will bounce back in terms of carbon sequestration. It will be able to take up carbon again and return to being a net carbon sink. And that is really, really interesting. And this is something that we had not been able to see at the scale that we've seen it before. And it's only been possible to see it because we have access to that long-term data set and to that site as a research natural observatory. So if I summarize what I've been talking about a little bit today, is that these long-term records and data, like the ones that we're connecting at Munsary, are absolutely essential to help us understand peatlands respond to land use and climate change. Because peatlands are not very quick to respond to things, might take a long time, and having that long-term kind of data set allows us to put everything into the wider, bigger, longer-term context. And the fact that we're able to embed research into management and have that conversation with the management, the team at Munsary, means that we can be far more responsive when there are opportunities, whether they are a funding call or extreme events that we think we need to get some data on. And finally, I'd like to highlight that the research is undertaken at Munsary. It might seem like a little local nature reserve for the people of Caithness and Sutherland, but actually the research there is absolutely world-leading and globally relevant in the context of peatland research, so should not be belittled. And I wanted to finish by pointing out that this is actually part of the vision for Munsary, taken straight out of the vision statement for the upcoming management strategy. We hope that Munsary can provide, can make sure that scientific research is at the heart of Plantlife Munsary, and that the links with Research Institute have facilitated and will continue to facilitate an ongoing programme of cutting-edge research on the reserve, leading to its better management and a better understanding of the function and importance of Blankhead Bog, and dare I say, of all peatlands, for biodiversity and for carbon sequestration. And I'd just like to thank again everybody who's been involved in the research. I've only named a few people, and also thank the funding agencies that have supported us financially. And if you have any question, I'll be more than happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roxanne, and thank you, Michael. That was brilliant. That was fantastic. I feel like we've just been on an amazing walk across the Munsary and an expedition across the Munsary, both in terms of actually walking across the bog, a journey across the bog, but also a journey through time as well, right back from the start when there was so much pressure and threat on this habitat all the way through to today, where we can really see the flow country and Munsary, although it might feel like a long way from where many of us live, really, really at the heart of current discussions, urgent discussions about biodiversity and climate. And it's fantastic to be a part of and to hear what's going on. It's amazing. And thank goodness it didn't go for Christmas trees. That would have been a disaster. Absolute disaster. Okay, now what we do have is a few minutes for questions. So I'm just going to pull up the questions here. So what I'll do, I will have a quick read through the questions and I'll come to the panel, and then between us, we will answer them. So what it looks like is we've got, and I think these are both good questions and they're kind of related. And it's about tree planting nowadays. So Michael was obviously talking about the threats that the flow country was facing in the past from tree planting. What safeguards are there to stop that happening again? Michael, you suggested that you maybe thought that that wouldn't happen again, but the point is being made here is that there's a kind of a renewed push for tree planting as a solution, if you want to call it that, to climate change. So is that causing a threat or a potential threat? And there's also a question about whether wind farms on peat are causing a threat and how we balance those. So it's really, are we still seeing threats from tree planting and other pressures?
I mean, yes, potentially that is an issue that continues to arise and will continue to arise. But I think it is pretty well recognised that trying to plant trees on peatland, I mean, first of all, the trees are pretty unlikely to develop into a valid commercial crop. Yes, they will lock up some carbon, but you'll be losing as much carbon from the peat, probably losing more carbon from the peat than the trees take in. So in carbon terms, it does not make sense. And it's absolutely the same with wind turbines. To put a wind turbine, I mean, both Roxanne and I have talked about how squishy the bog is at Munsary. If you put a wind turbine up in that, it would just blow over in the first gale. So you need to put vast quantities of concrete at the base of the wind turbine to make it stand up in peat. First of all, you have to dig out the peat, so you're losing all the carbon from the peat that you dig out. And then there's not a material that is worse for giving off carbon than making concrete manufacturing. I forget the figure, but it's something like 15% of carbon output comes from concrete worldwide. So it's the worst possible thing to do. So there should be planning mechanisms in place to stop either of these things happening certainly on functioning peatlands. It's a slightly different issue if you've got a highly degraded peat bog. But to my mind, a highly degraded peat bog is a challenge for the future to make it into a functioning peat bog, not doing anything else with it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Roxanne, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the plantation, there is a risk, and it's not just for peatland. And I think that the risk is that if we chase targets of tree plantings and numbers of tree planted, we might end up putting trees in the wrong place. Whether the wrong place is on a bog or somewhere else is irrelevant, really. So I think that what is important is that we don't end up chasing numbers and areas of tree planting, but that we have careful thinking behind the policies to ensure that the right trees are planted in the right place. And I think that is really the important thing. Right tree in the right place will deliver the climate and biodiversity benefits. Right tree, wrong tree in the wrong place will do just the opposite, and that's what we've documented and seen for the trees and conifers in particular on the flow country peatland. There is policy mechanisms in place to stop planting in peat at the moment, but the issue is where the trees have already been planted in peat, where there might be competing policy targets of peatland restoration and replanting some of those areas, and there's going to be difficult conversation and difficult decisions. I think that having the science to underpin it is absolutely critical, but also I think that making sure that the policies are in place, not chasing numbers, but really enable these rationale to be fully understood is really important. And that, I think the same applies for wind farms. If we have policy or planning mechanisms in place, but we need to make sure that they are robust and underpinned by evidence, and maybe continuously reviewed to make sure that as new evidence comes to light, it can be integrated readily into those decision making.
Thank you, Roxanne. And that's definitely Plantlife's position, and we've been raising the profile of this and campaigning on this quite a bit, both in respect of peatlands and also other important open habitats like grasslands. And we're aware that the ambitious planting targets that are in the main very welcome, when they're, as you say, Roxanne, positioned in the wrong place, they could have effects which completely counter to the effects that they're trying to have. And it is a concern.
If I might add, we are moving in the right direction. Scottish Forestry said in July of this year that as of the 1st of October, so this month, that they're not accepting any grant applications, which include plowing on soils where peat depth is exceeding of like 10 centimeters or something. So we are moving in a positive direction, but like Roxanne said, it's about the peat that is already here. I believe the IUCN had a report for their peatland program, and it showed that in the UK, Scotland had a net increase of tree planting on peat between 1990 and 2013. So it is more of a past issue than it is a future one.
Thanks, Erin. It is encouraging that we do seem to be moving in the right direction, and we're kind of going from no planting on deep peat to no planting on shallower peats, and the message is getting through. There's probably just got time for one more question, actually. There's a question specifically for Roxanne. Your research is incredible, gives us all hope, which I think we'd all agree with that. Can the data that you're generating, can that be used, and the mapping, can that be used to highlight plantations that could be removed, drains that could be blocked as recommendations for immediate action? So for example, could that be used, I think, by Nature Scot and Peatland Action Fund, kind of prioritization of work, and how can it be applied at that scale?
I think the answer is yes and no. So the answer is yes. We've been working with Nature Scot now for several years, and Peatland Action Programme in particular, to look at how that particular method could be used, not necessarily to identify which plantation should be removed, because that there's a whole lot of other conditions that go around, or processes that go into that decision making. But what we've been able to do is generate, for example, a whole of the UK map of peatland, highlighting areas where there's the highest kind of subsidence, and these are probably the areas where there's the most carbon losses occurring at the moment. So they could be used as kind of strategic decision help or support for decision making. We're not quite there yet, but we are able to do it with the technique, but we still need to be more convincing with our argumentation in terms of the validation to get that technique accepted in terms of strategic implementation. However, in terms of peatland action, what I can say as well is that, we could have the best top-down will in the world and the best strategic decision in the world. The current mechanisms of funding are really dependent on uptake by landowners and land managers. And at the moment, it can't be strategic. It has to be bottom up. It has to be the money is available, and the best projects that are put forward go forward for funding. That might depend on landowners' willingness to interact with the grants. That could also depend on the areas, the size, the access, the time of the year, and so on. So it's not that easy to have a strategic and a bottom-up approach that meets somewhere in the middle, but I think this is the direction of travel, definitely, and I hope that our research will help support that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Roxanne. I'm afraid we're out of time. We're under kind of strict instructions to keep to time, and that is us there. That's been fascinating. Thank you to everyone for your questions. I really hope everybody enjoyed our expedition across Munsary, and hopefully now you know a bit more about our most northerly nature reserve and why it's important. These are big challenges. These are big challenges that we're facing today around biodiversity and around climate. And sometimes those challenges can seem too massive, they can seem too big to grapple with, and the temptation is to stick our heads in the sand. But I think that what we've heard today should really give us hope. We can restore ecosystems, we can help the planet and its wildlife recover. We know how to do this, and I think that we've demonstrated at Munsary that we do know how to do this. We've just got to want to do it. A huge thank you to our speakers, Michael Scott and Roxanne Anderson. Thank you to Erin for making sure that everything is run so smoothly. And a massive thank you to everybody for coming along today. So Plantlife's Fall into Nature is running for the rest of October. We've got lots more interesting events coming up. So please do check out the programme, stay in touch with Plantlife, follow us on social media and support Plantlife's work. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you and goodbye.